And we are happy to welcome back to the program, on the line from Washington, D.C., Ron Suskind, author of The Confidence Men, Wall Street, Washington, and the Education of a President. Ron, really enjoyed the book. Thanks for coming on the program again. How you doing today?
I'm just great, Steve. How are you?
Just great. Thank you very much. Let's start here. When Barack Obama ran against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic presidential nomination, he suggested that good judgment was as important as a lot of experience. So when he won not only the nomination but the presidency, and didn't obviously have a lot of experience, he picked people who had a lot of experience for his administration. Question, did he pick the right people?
Well, there's a lot of folks in the Democratic Party, I think even some independents, who would say that the team Obama brought to Washington may not have been the best team in terms of the wider historical arc of what he might have done as president. He clearly did incline away from the team that brought him to victory on his campaign, a more, I think, ecumenical, bipartisan, and an activist team that wanted to restructure maybe the financial system in America, do some more dramatic things. He went with a team that was more inclined toward caution. First, do no harm was the motto of the team, allied with Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, the chief economic advisor, Tim Geithner, still the Treasury Secretary, whose motto was Hippocratic risk, first do no harm. That caution, though some would say that's all he had an opportunity to do to restore a collapsed financial system at a time when the economy was melting. That also, now looking back, was a tough decision, and some people say he made the wrong one.
Well, the title of the book is Confidence Men, and of course, you shorten that, it's con men, and that's not necessarily a compliment. Is that what you mean to say?
No, I never call the president a con man in the book. The issue of confidence is one that goes through the whole narrative. Confidence is really the coin of the realm in America. It's gone way back to the start of the Republic. Roosevelt restores it during the Depression. Kennedy enlivens it as he arrives. Reagan, certainly a master at instilling confidence in people, and you can see the outcomes there. Obama wrestles with this issue of confidence, earned confidence versus what has largely been manufactured confidence, certainly on Wall Street in the past decade or two, and some would say on our political system as well. Obama arrives saying, I'm going to earn confidence, I'm going to earn it with actions, I'm going to essentially create a new conversation, a new, more, let's just say, amicable and productive conversation in Washington. And he learned some hard lessons. He really runs into a buzzsaw when it comes to the permanent government of Washington, and in many ways faces the ongoing power of the financial capital of New York and Wall Street. And it's quite a bloodbath.
Let me ask you about a few of those confidence men, though. You've mentioned a couple of them already in Summers and Geithner, and I want to add Rahm Emanuel, his former chief of staff, to that list. If I'm reading correctly in the book, you almost seem to suggest that these three, in some respects, go behind his back, undermine the presidency, don't deliver for him that which he wants. Is that right?
There are many instances in the book that I've reported, and it's a reported book. I'm an investigative reporter. I spent years inside of the White House. I'm not on either the blue team or the red team. I'm a journalist. And what I found time and again, the president wanting to do things, in many cases much more dramatic things in terms of Rooseveltian-style actions. And he ran into significantly this trio, Emanuel, Summers, and Geithner, all of whom served long terms with Bill Clinton. They knew each other for years together. Their conversations with one another was often as much defining of policy as anything they said or didn't say to the president.
Well, let's try one thing with Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary. There's one point where Citigroup is a massive mess, and the president obviously wants something significant done about this, and Tim Geithner doesn't really appear to be all that interested in doing what the president wants. What didn't he do that the president wanted him to do?
This was a very interesting point in this presidency. Obama arrives, you remember 2 million people were weeping on the Mall and clapping on Inauguration Day. He had a 75% approval rating in February and March. And what you have is Obama saying, I can do this job. I don't have much experience. He hasn't been on the national stage very long, but he's a brilliant guy. And he gets a sense of this being history's moment. He wants to restructure the financial system in the United States. These too big to fail banks, he feels, are creating fear that one will collapse in another uncontrolled Lehman-style disaster. He wants to show that government can take one of them down, unwind them several of them, in fact, without that happening. He says that will kill much of the caution and the fear that is holding people back in America from investing, from spending, from building. That's what he wants to do in March of 2009, really at a moment of great opportunity in terms of the crisis and what he can do with that crisis. He moves forward. He tells Tim Geithner, even after the president just says, just Citigroup, let's just do one bank with $200 billion left in TARP, let's try that. He tells Tim Geithner, draw up a plan, only Treasury can do that. A month later, there is no plan. Geithner doesn't agree with this policy. He essentially says to not just the president, but even Larry Summers was with the president on this one. He usually is with Geithner. He's not here. Geithner says, look, they don't understand. I was there in the previous fall when the economy melted down. Geithner, of course, was at the New York Fed in those days. He and Paulson and Bernanke in the midst of crisis. The president hears that there's no plan for Citi. He sees this as a key tool in his arsenal. He's angry, and in the Oval Office he says there better be a plan, but there isn't one. This is a moment where the president kind of gets the wind knocked out of him based on the reporting and talking to all of his senior aides, and in a way even talking to the president himself. He doesn't dispute any of the key disclosures in the book. He talks about hard lessons he learned, not only in terms of the difficulty of these issues, but how to run his White House, how to have it express his will. And that's a drama that passes through the first 2 years. Obama getting control of his White House so it does what he wants.
Last time you were on this program, we talked about your book about Paul O'Neill, who was the Treasury Secretary for George W. Bush. When the two of them ran afoul, Bush fired him. How is it that Treasury Secretary Geithner is able to consistently run afoul of this president's wishes, but 3 years later, he's still there?
Well, I think that's something you're probably going to have to wait to read either or both men's memoirs to understand more deeply. I think there is a bond between the two men. I do write about that significantly in the book. I think that part of it is Obama was not expert in economics or finance. Geithner was, I think, often the fallback guy. Larry Summers was too, when the president had to close the door and say, let's go over that again, explain that to me. How exactly does that work? What are the risks? What are the potential rewards? Geithner actually had an interesting position in the debates inside of the White House. He was the man who was ready for the default position of caution. When the president couldn't get consensus of his senior advisors, and the president felt unless he had that consensus, in a way he didn't have the confidence to act in areas that were not familiar to him, it defaulted back to Geithner's position of caution. First, do no harm. That ends up being the position the president takes. Other people like Paul Volcker, who's another character, there are dozens of them in the book, the former Fed chairman, sort of the avatar of tough love in America. He choked off interest rates, of course, in the early 80s and killed inflation. Volcker is a key advisor to Obama during the campaign. He is recommending more dramatic action, and his position is if you embrace the idea that first do no harm, you're not going to do anything. Dramatic action by government will create harm to some constituents in America. Maybe government's role is to soften the blow to those people. But harm and disruption is part of the game if you're going to do something dramatic, Rooseveltian, something that lasts. Obama has trouble doing that through his first 2 years.
Your book has created, I think it's fair to say, a bit of a storm. And to that end, I want to play a clip of Jay Carney, the White House press secretary, and then we'll come back and get your reaction to that. Michael, roll the tape, please.
You bet.
Look, I too have not read the book, although I've read a lot about it. What we know is that very simple things, facts that could be ascertained, dates, titles, statistics, quotes, are wrong in this book. So I think that, in fact, one passage seems to be lifted almost entirely from Wikipedia in the book. I think based on that, I would caution anyone to assume that if you can't get those things right, that you suddenly get the broader analysis right. That analysis is wrong.
Okay, you know you're off the president's Christmas card list now, but go ahead and respond to what Jay Carney had to say.
That's just classic Washington misdirection. Jay hadn't read the book. People have read it now. Obviously, they see it's very authoritative. There's dozens of pages of source notes. There are no quotes that are wrong in the book. In any book like this, if they bring a team together, which the White House does prior to publication, they got the book a couple days in advance. They go through every single letter in the book. They find some factoids. Wait a second, is that right? Is that spelling right? That's what the White House did at the start. What was amazing is that they did not respond in any material way to the fundamental disclosures of the book. They still haven't. And now that the dust has settled, I think they're hoping it goes away. I think the position now, though, for most people, both left and right, because certainly many people on the left have said this is exactly what we feared, is the White House should take ownership of its own history, which this book lays out, letter and verse, across this period. In a way, what's interesting is that the White House cooperation, especially in the final portion of the book, was because they had to take ownership of these difficult times that the president went through. The president says forcefully in our final interview, 45, 50 minutes, he says, look, I learned some hard lessons. It was very difficult, but I'm now the president that America needs at a time of peril. Interestingly, it takes presidents a year, sometimes a year and a half to learn this job. Barack Obama walked right into periods of great crisis. The White House was clear on that. They embraced the idea of the evolution of this president, understandably, having to learn some very, very difficult lessons. He never had managed anything in his life, and that he had grown strong and clear and more vigorous because he now had been muscled up by adversity. Some of it from within his White House. Mind you, almost everyone in this original team where many of the disclosures rest are gone. The president has a new team, as he said, the team I need to do what I need to do. That's where the White House stood at the completion of the book. Of course, after that, the late summer of this year, when the book was off to the printer, they had some trouble because of the debt ceiling debacle. And all of a sudden, it seemed like those problems of the first year had never been solved. And that's, I think, why you're getting this White House pushback. But frankly, almost all that you're seeing there is very much past tense now.
Well, let me ask you about one quote in the book, which is really, actually, I want to find out who you got this from, because I know you weren't in the room, but it's a hell of a good quote. Larry Summers, quote, "We are home alone. There is no adult in charge. Clinton," meaning Bill, for whom he was Treasury Secretary, "would never have made these mistakes." Who told you that?
Let's talk about this. It's called the Home Alone riff. Larry said this often, leaving the Oval Office after the morning briefings with the president. It was after briefings on many subjects, economics, finance. I talk about in the book that he says it to many people. There are many sources for this. Specifically, one person speaks very boldly about it, about how they were troubled by it. Peter Orszag, who is also a senior economic advisor with a long history with many of the actors in the book, and obviously very faithful to the president, as he says in a comment since the book's released. Orszag is one of the people troubled by it. You know, he says, look, is Larry right or not? He disagrees with Larry, but Larry Summers is a guy who knows how to frame arguments. That's his particular genius, and it's something, this Home Alone riff, is something that troubles people. Now, mind you, this, like all the key disclosures and the central quotes in the book, were run by those who speak them prior to publication. Larry and I discussed this quote, and his comments about it are in the book. He takes a kind of reluctant ownership of it. He knows other people heard him say it. And he says, frankly, in the book, there were many problems. We had 5 times as many problems. We didn't have 5 times as many people. It was a time of crisis. Essentially, that almost anyone would be overwhelmed at the moment the president sat in that Oval Office as the world collapsed. That's Larry's response. There is no dispute about any of the key quotes in the book, including that one.
Okay, let's finish up on this one item before we get the others to join us and broaden the discussion. One of the telling lessons that Obama claims to have learned is that politics is as important as policy. And so the question is, has this guy been too much of a policy wonk in order to have been an effective president?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, Steve. Obama, in our interview, speaks with great passion about that and some real, let's just say, insight and clarity about himself. He says, look, I and Carter and Clinton suffer from what he calls the policy wonk's disease. He says, I am not legislator-in-chief. He talks about his technocratic affections and inclinations. He wants to get past that. He's realized, having spent 2.5 years at that point inside of the policy shop inside of his White House, that he's not going to get answers necessarily by bringing in lots of smart people with sterling credentials into a room and saying, well, you all need to agree. They're not agreeing. The tough decisions presidents make that Obama essentially says now is when you don't have enough evidence, when there's not a clear case to be made. You've got to make that case. You've got to be firm. You've got to show conviction. That's what Obama, I think, has learned, that a lot of presidents learn, whether it's John F. Kennedy with his best and brightest or Barack Obama with the challenges he's faced.